Evening. Good evening. Welcome to Viterbo University. And I want to say this is a partnership, this event, between the D.B. Reinhardt Institute for Ethics and Leadership and Leader Ethics. And we owe a special debt of gratitude to Keith Knutson, who teaches political science here and has been teaching here for many years, and always held an event on Constitution Day for many, many years until he asked the Reinhardt Institute and Leader Ethics if we would take it over and help do it. So Keith, you're right here. Let's all give Keith a round of applause. For this event tonight, we're going to be asking for questions from the audience. And you've been given little pieces of paper and pen. About 7:30, our students will be collecting those questions, so you can just pass them down to the end of the row whenever you have them ready after about 7:30, and then we'll be feeding them up here, and Rusty Cunningham will be our moderator answering the questions. So now to introduce our event is Lee Roche, the Executive Director of Leader Ethics.
Thanks, Rick, and I'm absolutely delighted to see that you came out today for this important event. We have an important election every election cycle, but arguably this is one of the more important because we're getting so much attention because Wisconsin is considered a key state. So I am Lee Roche with Leader Ethics, and our organization is in our 7th year now, and we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that's committed to promoting ethical leadership among elected officials. And we believe that ethical leadership is really defined by 4 key principles. Ethical leaders are truthful, they're transparent with public information, they're unifiers, not dividers, and to the best of their ability, they work to represent their entire constituency, not just the simple majority that may have voted for them. And we're absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to be a partner with Viterbo in the Constitution Day programming. Each year, this partnership is going to go through a deep dive on one of the key areas in the U.S. Constitution and allow us to get a better understanding of the full comprehensive document that we own. And today we're going into one of the most important areas, and that's the elections process, the cornerstone of the Democratic Republic. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here to talk about this, and now I'd like to introduce our moderator in this conversation, John Smalley. John is the former executive editor of the Wisconsin State Journal, and he held that post for a number of years. Prior to that, he was editor at the Crosse Tribune. And after leaving the State Journal, he actually did some adjunct work with the Wisconsin Elections Commission. So we have someone who is thoroughly prepared and able to be conversant in tonight's program. So I'm pleased to welcome John Smalley.
Thank you, Lee. Very much. I appreciate that. And thanks to Rick Kite and the Institute and Viterbo University for hosting. And happy Constitution Day for everybody out there. It's really wonderful to be back in La Crosse again. As Lee noted, I was at the Tribune. I was the editor there from 02 to 08. Also went to school in La Crosse at UW La Crosse, and a proud alum of UWL, and worked in between there at one other time before I had the honor of becoming editor at the Tribune. I thought today driving up here, I was remembering when I was the editor here, I was probably about 4 or 5 weeks into my job, and I went to the downtown La Crosse Rotary Club, my first meeting at the downtown Rotary, and I thought I would use the same line tonight that I used back then. As I looked over the crowd, I'm pretty sure I've been yelled at by over half the people in the room here. As editor of the paper, that just goes with the job. But this is a wonderful crowd. I'm only kidding, of course. So great for all of you to come out. Thank you for being here. Looking forward to a really fun evening and a great discussion with Meagan, and then with the Q&A portion toward the end. So thanks for being here. Let me get to the introduction then. Meagan Wolfe, as you likely know, is the administrator of the Wisconsin Elections Commission, serving as the state's nonpartisan chief election official since 2018. Advocating for election security and for the needs of Wisconsin's clerks and voters are among her highest priorities. Meagan previously served as the WEC's deputy administrator and as IT director before that, managing the teams that develop and maintain the statewide voter registration database, election security, and all other IT applications of the commission. Welcome, Meagan. Thank you for taking the time to come to beautiful La Crosse this evening, and let's jump into our conversation.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me today.
All right. We'll start a little bit of background about yourself, Meagan, just to give people a sense of who you are and where you came from and that sort of thing. And please do, as I always prompt you to do, say something about Culver's.
So I've been in elections at the state agency for 13 years. So this is lucky year 13 for me. And I've had the really good fortune to be able to be in a number of different positions with the state elections entity. So I started out in voter outreach. I was first hired to implement the state's new photo ID law back in 2011 and got to go around the state and talk about the law. It was really good training for this position as the nonpartisan administrator, because at the time, that law was new and it was quite controversial. There were some people that loved it, some people that didn't like it, and so I'd start every presentation by saying, I'm not here to talk about if this is a good law, if this is a bad law, I'm just here to talk about what the law is and what everybody needs to know in order to be able to vote. And that's really carried through my 13 years here in elections. I find this job to be just a tremendous honor. I haven't had a single day where I've gone home and felt like what I did today didn't matter. One of my favorite parts about my job, though, is getting to work with all of our local election officials in all of our various communities, who I'm sure we'll talk about more throughout tonight's presentation. I grew up in a small town in Waupaca County, a place that was under 5,000 population. We did have a Culver's, and I did work there. So I'm familiar with custard and buttered burgers and all of that good stuff. But I really, truly do have a great appreciation for all things Wisconsin and for all the various corners of our state and the diversity that our state offers. I really appreciate the fact that my role is nonpartisan. I'm actually the only chief election official in the country that's required by law to be nonpartisan, and I find that just to be the most fantastic role to be in, because it means I get to focus on the facts about elections. I'm not interested in sort of the political talking points about elections. I'm interested in the facts. And so it's really been my tremendous honor to be able to serve in this position and to get to see our great state and how elections are run throughout this state of Wisconsin.
Speaking of that, the nonpartisan aspect of your role, a couple of questions on that. Number one, what's it like having 6 bosses? 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans is one question. And then the sort of the follow-up is, how do you, in a practical way, how do you manage being a nonpartisan administrative state agency in these hyper-partisan times? How does that work for you?
Yeah, really, really good questions, John. So having 6 bosses is interesting and a lot like it sounds in some ways, but it also, I think Wisconsin has such a unique model in terms of how we run elections that offers so much transparency. And what do I mean by that? So Wisconsin, we're run by a 6-member bipartisan commission that administers elections here. And I'm not a commissioner, so I have 3 Republican commissioners, 3 Democratic commissioners. They're all appointed by legislative leadership from the various parties. And whenever they need to make a decision about elections, so let's say we have a new law, or let's say we have a new court decision, they actually have to meet in public, and they have to get 4 votes of the 6 commissioners in order to implement it. My job as the nonpartisan administrator is to carry out their directives. But that's a really stark contrast to what we see in other states, not saying that their process is bad, it's just different. In other states, you're going to have a single elected partisan Secretary of State that's in charge of elections, and they have the ability to make those decisions on their own, unilaterally. Here, you get to actually see how the sausage is made, right, as they say. Every decision that's made by the commission is in public, and you can actually come and provide public comment to help inform them as they make those decisions. And so it can be sometimes challenging to find proposals or memoranda that we want to write to issue to the clerks that's going to be something that all 6 of the commissioners can support, because getting anything done in a bipartisan way these days can be very difficult. But I find that our commission, more often than not, they come to a unanimous consensus on these things, and that's really pretty incredible. And I think, again, it's such a unique model, but it offers so much transparency, and it's one that I'm glad to be a part of, to be able to work with them to find those areas of consensus.
Yeah, great. We're going to talk about that sausage making here in just a minute and get into some details on that. But before we get into the sort of the safeguards and the checks on our system, just a little bit more about your role in. Again, I know it's crazy busy. I also wanted to make this point, I guess is a good time to say this. Meagan's schedule is so full that it is great that she's here tonight, but Meagan and Riley Vetterkin, the Public Information Officer, and my boss at the agency right down there, Meagan and Riley have to scoot out tonight right after the event because A, there's a commission meeting tomorrow morning at 8:30, and B, they're flying to Michigan tomorrow for an event in Michigan on Wednesday and Thursday. So unfortunately, they won't be able to hang around and visit afterwards, but I appreciate both of them making the time to come up here tonight. Before we get off of your old, I see a lot of the times that the challenges and the long hours and the problems that you're dealing with and solving on a daily basis. How about, is there any fun? What's the most fun part of your job? Do you have any fun in the job?
Oh, there's definitely fun times on the job. So we have such a great opportunity to go out and meet with our local election officials. And there's probably a few here that have yelled at me, but there's more than a few here that have all, supported me, and we've all been through so much together. And so getting to have those opportunities to go and meet with our local election officials, have opportunities even to meet with voters around the state. Even the tough conversations, I actually find incredibly rewarding. Getting to go out into, small communities, hear people's questions about elections, and show them opportunities where they can get involved in the election process. So I really appreciate and enjoy that part of being able to go out and work with our local officials and our voters as well.
Yeah, and then how about the flip side of that coin? What's the least fun part of your job? What's the part that is not the most fun for you?
So, I think it's part of the job, and it's a very important part of the job, but it can be really frustrating as an election official when there are claims about elections that aren't based in fact that continue to persist. And it feels like no matter how many audits or court decisions or recounts that we conduct, that there will never be a satisfactory answer for some folks. And that can be really frustrating because I think as election officials, I know I do, I truly wake up every morning thinking, what more can I do? How can I do more? Am I not hitting the mark? Am I not giving people the information that they need? How can we adjust our approach to make it more effective? And so I think we really come to it from a genuine place as election officials, trying to help people be able to get access to the information that they're seeking to answer their questions. But sometimes we don't have the same sort of genuine interaction coming back at us, and that can be disheartening, right? Right,
yeah. Let's move into the notion of some of the safeguards and the checks and balances within our system that ensure a safe and secure elections. Probably starting with our decentralized system. You want to talk a little bit about how that's the structure itself is kind of a safeguard?
Yeah, so the state of Wisconsin, we are the most decentralized election administration system in the entire country. And what that means is that in other states, they mostly administer elections at the county level. So you'll see in other states where the county will have an elections department, they register voters, issue ballots, they do all things elections. Here in Wisconsin, the law actually tasks our municipal clerks with that role. So the municipal clerks, and there's 1,850 of them in the state of Wisconsin, are the ones who are registering voters, who are issuing ballots, training poll workers, setting up their polling place. And then, of course, our county clerks also play very important roles. They are the chief election official of their county, and many of them do so much to support their municipalities. But we do have a very localized election administration system here. States like Arizona, they have 15 county election officials that administer elections. And that's compared to our 1,850 municipal clerks and 72 county clerks. And so we have almost 2,000 local election officials. And so they really know their community. They know their voters. And they're able to more easily and accurately detect things that might be off because they know their communities so well, and elections are administered at that really, really local level.
And I guess that's sort of a blessing and a curse in the sense that because it is so dispersed and diffused, it's tough. Things like training and consistency and ensuring, that everybody's doing the same thing the same way. How much of a challenge is that?
That can certainly be challenging, but one of the things I do think helps us is that in a lot of states, they're seeing, we're all seeing turnover amongst our local election officials, and that can be hard to make sure that new people are trained and ready. Here in Wisconsin, because we're so decentralized, we've always had a lot of turnover, especially in our small communities, where the clerk might be part-time and only employed by their small town for 5 hours a week. We've always seen a lot of turnover in those areas. So what that means is we're really set up well to administer training very quickly to the local election officials. A lot of our counties do additional training to onboard those local election officials as well. And so while it's certainly challenging because we can't get everybody in one room to have a conversation or to have a training, we do have a really, I think, resilient process for onboarding new clerks and to be able to adapt for that type of turnover that we see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it happens a lot, and it's a big piece of the agency, I know, is the training of election officials.
It is, and we do a lot of in-person training, but we also do a lot of virtual training because again, our clerks, they may only be employed by their township for 5 hours a week, and so that means we can't do training during the day when they're at their other job, and so we have to have ways to meet them where they're at and to have training in the evenings. Sometimes we'll have webinars that are offered 2 or 3 times a day so that the clerks all have opportunities to join when they're able.
Meagan, could you just walk through quickly a couple of the other steps that are sort of inherent in the process that also are inherent safeguards and checks on the process in terms of what clerks do on election day and after?
Yeah, so there are so many things, if we look at, let's start with before an election. So before an election, we have the county clerks that are right now preparing ballots to be delivered to their municipal clerks, and those ballots go out 47 days before the election. So that means this coming Thursday, ballots are going to go out to voters. And again, absentee voting, that's happening by your municipal clerk, right? And so when you send in your request, it's your municipal clerk that's reviewing that. They're making sure first that you're registered to vote. If they get a request from somebody, but they don't have a corresponding voter registration, they're not going to issue a ballot. If they get back a ballot from somebody that hasn't requested one, they're not going to count that ballot, right? And so it's a very much the municipal clerk that's controlling that process and making sure that only lawful voters receive and have their ballot counted. And then before Election Day, there's also voting equipment tests that happen in each of your communities. And so if you've ever been curious about how does the voting equipment operate, in every single community 10 days before an election, there are actually public tests done of the equipment that you can go and be a part of. After Election Day, there are also many checks on the process as well. We have post-election audits where the commission determines how many jurisdictions are going to hand count their ballots to make sure that the total of the paper ballots are the same as the machine. And then there's also what we call canvass, which is a check on the process, and that happens at the municipal level, at the county level, and at the state level, where all the artifacts and numbers of the elections are examined to make sure they make sense before the election is certified. And so again, all these things aren't things that happen behind a closed door. They're things that happen in public that you can go observe as well.
And I know you have a very standard answer for folks who are maybe skeptical or unsure or worse maybe. What should they do? The answer is get involved, right? Get
involved, yeah. So there are so many opportunities to get involved, be it observing the election. You can observe elections in any community. It doesn't just have to be right here in La Crosse. Let's say that you feel good about how elections are run here, but you have questions about how they're run somewhere else. you can go observe there. You can go see Election Day. You can even go observe as the absentee ballots are counted, or as the canvass happens in public where they examine those ballots again and those totals again. And so I encourage people to get involved. There really are no locked doors or dark corners in elections. You can get involved in any step of the process. So you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to even take your local election official's word for it. You can actually go see firsthand how elections are run here.
Yeah, that's great. And a lot of people do, right? I mean, that's a very common thing.
They do. And a lot of events we do in various parts of the state, I'll hear from people that had concerns, that had questions, that were skeptical about the process, and they encourage other people to become poll workers because they did, and now that they know the mechanics of how the election work, that they feel more confident in the process. So, I really encourage people that have those questions to get involved. You don't have to take anybody else's word for it. You can go see for yourself.
And as we're heading into the 2024 on November 5th, for the average voter out there, anything that you would want them to know that's changed or different, or just to point out any highlights of things to be thinking about as they get ready to vote?
Yeah, so, really there aren't any major differences from 2020. There's certainly been a lot of litigation, examination of the election, but ultimately after all of that has concluded, there haven't been a whole lot of changes to the process. So I think that shows that our process withstood the tests, right?
Yeah.
Withstood the challenges and scrutiny, and I think that's something we should be proud of. But for the average voter, I'd say make sure that your voter registration is up to date. Today is actually National Voter Registration Day.
Right.
And so if you have a Wisconsin DMV product, a driver license, or a state ID card that's current and valid, you can actually register to vote online. If you don't have one of those products, you can still register to vote by mail or with your clerk, but make sure your registration is up to date. You can also register at the polls on Election Day, of course, but it's good to plan ahead, and you can do that by going to myvote.wi.gov, and you can actually check your registration status and make sure that you're all ready to go. You can request an absentee ballot once you're registered and you qualify. And you can even find out your polling place, view your sample ballot. So I would just say, make sure that everything's good to go, that you have a plan, that you know which way you plan to vote, whether it be by mail, in-person absentee, which happens in the 2 weeks before the election, or at the polls on Election Day. And you can find all that information at myvote.wi.gov.
Terrific, terrific. I want to take our next few minutes before we transition to the Q&A with the audience members, and I hope that people are writing down some questions, because we'd sure love to hear from you. We'll kind of transition to, let's talk about some of the sort of common misinformation or disinformation, or even just simple misunderstandings that are out there. What would you say are some of the common misunderstandings about the process here in Wisconsin?
Yeah, there have been a lot of different, claims made over, the last few years, and sometimes things sort of seem to resurface. A lot of our questions that we get are around absentee voting and kind of that process. I would say that one of the most common things we hear is that absentee ballots are allowed to come in for, weeks or days after an election and still be counted. That's actually not true. In other states, they may have different laws, but here in Wisconsin, every single absentee ballot has to be received by 8 p.m. on Election Day in order to be counted. And so the local election officials, they actually have to keep counting once they start. They can't adjourn and reconvene on election night. And so that's something that we hear a lot, is that people making claims that, absentee voting in Wisconsin is happening for a longer period of time, or there still are ballots that are being added to the totals. That's actually not accurate. All of the ballots have to be received by 8 p.m. on Election Day.
I think another common one is people sometimes have a difficulty differentiating the roles of the commission and the staff at the commission and the people on the field, the clerks in the field. The WEC does not run the local elections, correct?
Right, yeah, that's another common one that we hear. A lot of times we'll get claims that our office is issuing ballots to voters, that we're adding or subtracting people from the voter rolls or the poll book. All of those things are things that happen through your municipal clerk. And so those are happening in your city, town, or village, where they're the ones issuing ballots. They're the ones registering voters. They're the ones conducting daily list maintenance to make sure that only eligible voters are on the poll book. And a lot of those things don't happen at the state level. And so that's a very common misperception about elections in Wisconsin. And also, yes, our commission model. I think sometimes when people are angry about a process or they see something they don't agree with, they want to blame, a single person. And here in Wisconsin, we actually have, again, this 6-member commission that meets in public, and oftentimes their decisions end up being attributed to me, even though I don't have a vote on the commission. And so, I again encourage people to get involved. If they don't agree with the decision of the commission, you can come and present public comment, you can submit written comments, you can actually be a part of those conversations, and you can watch the meetings and see how the decisions are made, how the deliberations happen.
Right. Speaking of the poll books that you mentioned a minute ago, what is the deal with having all of these deceased people on the database? People ask that question a lot. Why are we not clearing out that database and making it only active live voters?
Yeah, so we get that question too, is claims that we have both active and inactive people on the poll book or in the database. And that's actually not true. So a poll book is who is eligible to vote, right? The poll book is registered Wisconsin voters that are eligible to vote, that your clerk has examined your voter registration, and they've deemed that you're eligible to receive a ballot. Those are our active voters. An inactive record, so somebody that's deceased or maybe was convicted of a felony and is no longer eligible to vote, they are removed from the poll book. They're removed from the database of eligible voters, but we still have to, of course, keep that history, right? Because it's really important history to have. If somebody calls us up and says, I'd like to buy data to see if this person was removed or what their voter history was, we have that historical data, but those inactive records will never appear on the poll book, the list of registered voters that are eligible to receive a ballot. But we do maintain all of the history of former Wisconsin voters because as a state entity, we're required to maintain those historical records.
Do you want to talk for just a minute about the public access to the database and how people can make purchases and what they do with that?
Yeah, so we actually have a website called badgervoters.wi.gov. And anybody, so we get requests from political parties, from the media, from academics, can go there and actually purchase data from the statewide database. So let's say you're curious about who has received an absentee ballot, who has returned it, what type of list maintenance has been conducted. Those are reports that those groups are buying all the time. So in an election year like this, we do produce a lot of reports for these groups. There's political parties, campaigns that will buy the whole statewide voter registration database on a daily basis, and they'll look at all that data, analyze it to draw their own conclusions or do their own outreach. And so the data that's in the statewide database that our local election officials enter in about voter registrations, absentee voting, that's not locked away and nobody can see it. There's people looking at that data, requesting that data every single day. I think as of today, in 2024, we've had over 2,000 requests for data through the Badger Voters site.
Yeah, it's a busy site. I
Yeah.
know that. A couple of questions more on election day type focus. Let's talk about the so-called ballot dumps on election night. What is that all about, especially in the larger cities, and are there concerns there?
Yeah, so when you see the news on election night, you're used to seeing that ticker across the news that says this is how many precincts are in and this is what the totals look like. Those are actually completely unofficial results. So what you're seeing is actually unofficial results where you have the media stringers that are calling in things from the local polling places. What that information is not telling you is that in a lot of jurisdictions, they centrally count the absentee ballots. So the law provides for a process that's called central count. And in central count, all the absentees are processed in one location, the public can go observe, and then the in-person absentees happen at each of the polling places. So if you have a large community, you might have 20 polling places where all the in-person absentee votes are cast on the tabulators there on election day, but all the absentees for all the various polling places are processed in one place. So on the news on election night, when they say this many precincts are in, they're not accounting for the absentees that haven't been added to those totals yet. And the absentees can't be added to the totals until they've all been counted. And so that's why in these larger jurisdictions that count their absentees centrally, you will later, after all the absentees are counted, see those numbers added in to their precincts. And so there's about 35 communities in the state of Wisconsin that use central count. They actually have to pass a local ordinance and go through all these steps to do so. But another thing that I think is interesting about that is in central count communities, they actually have to post on election day how many absentees they have, right? So you'll know the number, the scope of how many absentees still need to be added to those election day polling place totals. So, it is a complicated process, but a lot of times it ends up being fodder for misinformation around the elections because people, aren't given that information about what they're seeing.
Right. I want to say I'm glad to hear we have at least one young voter or future voter in the crowd yelling out a question. I couldn't hear it quite, but no, that's great. One other favorite familiar topic, drop boxes. That's been obviously a controversial topic. The Supreme Court ruled one way, and then the newer Supreme Court ruled another way. What's the deal with drop boxes, and should people be concerned? Are there concerns? And in 2020, was there any problem with drop boxes?
Yeah, so there was never any determination that there was any sort of wrongdoing in terms of drop boxes in 2020. Drop boxes had actually been used in the state of Wisconsin, many by our rural communities, for more than 20 years. So there are a lot of smaller communities that for many, many years had drop box opportunities for their community members to return their ballots. That, like you said, was challenged after the 2020 elections, and there was a period of time for the last few years where the court decision was that they could not be used. Now the court has ruled that they can be used, but it's up to each municipal clerk to decide whether or not that's the right fit for their communities. It's also up to each municipal clerk to decide how to implement them in a secure manner. And so the commission met in a public meeting and they put out some guidance that clerks should consider if they're considering drop boxes for their community. How do they make sure that those are secure? How do they make sure that those aren't something that can be tampered with or that can be, damaged somehow? And so those are all considerations that each community is going to have to make to decide whether or not it's the right fit for them and if they're able to offer a secure return option. But there has never been any, verified, claims that there were any type of, tampering due to drop boxes in the past.
Last thing, and then we'll go to the audience questions, and maybe just a little bit of an explainer on, because again, I think it's often misunderstood, ERIC, our membership, Wisconsin's membership in ERIC, and maybe you could explain what ERIC is and why people sometimes get confused.
Yeah, so ERIC stands for the Electronic Registration Information Center, and it's a consortium of states around the country that are able to essentially submit data from their DMVs and their statewide voter registration databases so that we have additional information to provide to local election officials so that they can manage the poll books, the statewide voter registration database. And so the ERIC system is something that the state of Wisconsin by law is required to be a member of. The law says that we have to be members and follow the membership agreement. And what that means for the state of Wisconsin is we get information we wouldn't otherwise be able to get. So for example, if a voter is deceased and if they die in state, we'll get that information from the State Vital Records Office. However, if somebody had moved or they were a snowbird and they happened to be deceased in another state, we wouldn't get that information unless we were members of ERIC. And so ERIC provides us information about the voter registration information from other states. So we're able to see, does somebody have a voter registration both in Wisconsin and in Illinois? We can only get that information through ERIC. We wouldn't otherwise have that information. And so it really just allows us access to additional data that the local election officials then use to make sure that the poll books are as accurate as possible.
Very good. Well, it looks like we have some questions coming in. I want to make sure that we leave adequate time to address those. Looks like Rusty's going to come on up here. There's another one. Thank you all for submitting questions. Appreciate that. Looks like, Lee, there might be another one right down here. Yep.
Well, I'll look over some of the questions, but before I do, I have a couple that I'm curious about. I get to, as a journalist, look at election news from other states. I see some of the things going on in Texas. I'm a journalist from Illinois. That's where my family is from. You may have heard we have a little history with elections there. Do people from other states look to Wisconsin, look to you as a resource to help them administer their elections?
Yeah, that's a great question. We certainly are seen as a leader in election administration across the country. Again, our model of having this bipartisan commission and a nonpartisan chief election official is unique. There are a few other states that do it the same way as Wisconsin, but it is unique. We historically have ranked very high in any of the different academic reports that take a look at election administration across the country. Wisconsin has very high voter turnout. We have, very low errors that are identified as part of our process. And so we do rank very highly in terms of how we administer our elections, and we are seen as an example across the country.
And Rusty, as a parallel to that, I would submit that, and again, Meagan won't say this herself, but she is highly respected across the country. She has led the national organizations that election directors participate in, and she has won more national recognition awards than I can keep track of. So we're very fortunate to have her in our
We are
list.
indeed. I'm curious, and there are some really good questions that you've submitted, so I'm going to get to those in just a second. I know what Election Day is like for a journalist, and often it goes more than one day. But since you have so many quirks and everything I know runs smoothly, your Election Day is probably pretty quiet, right? You don't get any phone calls. You don't, and it's done when the polls close and you go home and everything's good, right?
Oh, that's about right. No. Honestly, I have the easy job compared to our local election officials. They're the ones that work these really long days to make sure every ballot is counted correctly, and then right away start the canvassing process where they have to go through and double check all the numbers. And so they're the ones with the hard jobs. I think our local election officials, our poll workers, our chief inspectors, all the folks that work at your polls, administer your elections, they're the real heroes of Election Day. At our office, we are busy though, the days around the election. There's typically a very sleepless night into the next day of supporting the local election officials. We will answer over 1 million contacts to our office in the months around the election, and that's just what we do. When voters call and have questions, when clerks call and have questions, we're answering those, providing people with resources.
Very helpful. You don't have the magic wand.
No,
You do what this 3 Republican, 3 Democrat board will suggest. But if you did have the magic wand, what are the changes or improvements you'd like to see in the Wisconsin election process?
So I think one of the things that would be really helpful for administering elections in the state of Wisconsin is if there were the ability to not have a partisan lens on how elections are administered and to fund elections appropriately, it would really be a game changer. And I mean that both at the state level, where we've seen our responsibilities and statutory responsibilities, litigation, it's all increased tremendously, but at the local level too. The fact that we have townships that can only pay their clerk to work 5 hours a week to administer elections, I think that's something that really needs to change. We need to find a way to sustainably fund election administration in the state of Wisconsin.
And as you said, 1,850 election clerks in our state.
Yep, that's right. And over 1,200 of them are in towns, so those are our smallest jurisdictions.
There's a question here that I think is good, especially in a town with 3 higher eds. Is there any guidance on how the Wisconsin Election Commission website, is it correct regarding college student voting? Maybe another way to ask that is, what's all involved? When a college student moves from another part of the state and moves to UWL or Viterbo or Western, what does that student have to do? How are we sure that student doesn't vote in the college community they're attending and back home?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So a couple of things. First of all, to be qualified to register to vote somewhere, you have to have lived there for 28 days with no present intent to move. And so that means if somebody has, moved to La Crosse and this is now their residence, they have no present intent to move, they're eligible to register to vote here. If, of course, they complete the proper forms, they're able to make all the certifications and provide the documentation, then they're eligible to register to vote here. They can also, if they have intent to move back to where they're from, they could remain registered there if they wanted to, but they couldn't then again, register here. But that's sort of, the choice they have to make based on their intent of where they plan to live and reside. How do we know that somebody's not registered in two places? Every single night, the statewide voter registration database is looking for duplicate registrations. So if somebody registers to vote in La Crosse and they were already registered to vote back in Madison where they grew up, then the statewide voter registration database is going to flag that for the municipal clerk. They're going to say, you have a voter in your jurisdiction, but they also have a record in Madison. They can only have one, so the old record's going to need to be deactivated and brought in as history to the new record. But that's happening every single night where those checks happen to make sure that we don't have duplicate voter registrations.
And Meagan, if that student lived in Rusty's home state of Illinois and registered in Illinois and also registered in La Crosse, how would we catch that?
Through ERIC data. So ERIC is providing information about voters that have registered in other states. And so the same sort of process. The local clerk is going to get an alert saying we now have this voter, we have verification that they're registered to vote in this other state. So we deactivate their Wisconsin registration, or vice versa. Illinois would get a notification saying Wisconsin now has this person registered to vote there, and so then Illinois will deactivate that registration.
I'm going to mash up about 3 or 4 postcards here, but it's all the same basic topic. It's about technology. What, if any, role does AI play in elections? Are any of the ballot machines hooked up to the internet? And what is the biggest misconception, especially regarding cybersecurity and hacking?
Yeah, all really good questions. So AI, that's an evolving field for all of us. We certainly don't have, our heads in the sand. But I also think that, it's something where if we're seeing sort of misleading information or campaigning that has been created using AI, there are mechanisms for voters to be able to, bring that to the attention of the proper entity. In a lot of cases, that's going to be the Ethics Commission that might deal with some of those campaign-type violations. For elections itself, I think, we've always had to compete with a lot of sensational claims about elections, or people using Photoshop or other tools to create things intended to mislead people about elections. And so I don't think that AI necessarily introduces something new for us. It's really just about informing voters about how to be media literate, how to examine things that they're seeing or coming across to really verify those claims that they're seeing. And in the case of elections, check in with your local election official. If you're seeing something that looks sensational, it's probably not true. It's probably something that you should talk to an election official about or go see for yourself. Because elections are really fact-based. They're quite boring, honestly, when you really get down to the nuts and bolts of it. And so if you're seeing those sensational claims about elections, I think that should be your first red flag that you need to do a little more due diligence to dig into that claim.
And as voters, we have a responsibility to do that very thing.
Rusty, if I could interject
Please.
on that topic again on the technology. Meagan, could you talk just briefly about our both state and federal partners in cybersecurity and CISA and the tabletop exercises, that sort of thing, and how we have these partners that help us in that regard?
Yeah, when it comes to cybersecurity, it's something that has been worked on and fine-tuned over the last decade. And for us, we do a lot of work with our local election officials to make sure that they're all at a baseline for cybersecurity. We were one of the first states to implement some heightened security measures for our statewide voter registration database for our locals. We've had a lot of federal grant opportunities that we've created for local election officials to make sure that they're all able to do things like purchase computers that are up to date and meet today's standards. And so it's something that we're always working on. We also were designated as critical infrastructure by the Department of Homeland Security in 2017. Elections was. And what that means is that we have access to other federal resources that allow local election officials and state election officials the ability to access all sorts of very high-tech assessments of our technology that we probably wouldn't otherwise be able to access if we had to pay for these things. And so that's been something that's been very, very helpful for elections as well. And as John said, we even practice our responses for cybersecurity incidents. So we do a lot of different trainings with our local officials at the state level, practicing how would we respond to some type of cyber incident were it to occur. But the bottom line, the takeaway from all of that is remember that every single ballot cast in the state of Wisconsin has a paper trail. Every single ballot cast has a paper trail that's the official artifact of the election. So if there were some type of, incident, that paper record is always going to be what's used as the official artifact of the election. There's also paper registrations, and other things that are used in the event of a recount or challenge.
One of our audience members asks, what keeps you up at night as the administrator of WEC?
Phone calls from commissioners?
I think that I've been able to grow a pretty thick skin over the years in terms of understanding what are the things that really deserve our time and attention. I try really hard not to needlessly worry about the things that we can't control. But I am always thinking about, are we doing enough to educate our voters? Are we doing enough to make sure that our clerks have the support that we need? So I don't have any particular worry necessarily at this time, but I do, always try to think about ways that we could do better. And I guess, if there was one sort of fear I have, it's that no matter how great of a job we do administering our election, no matter how many examinations the election goes through, or verification steps or recounts, that there's still going to be people that don't trust the results. And that worries me, because I want to think about what could we do to avoid that? How could we get people more engaged in the process so that folks can have confidence in the result? And so that's something that I think I and your local election officials are thinking about every day is, what more can we do? Because we really want people to feel good about our elections. We want people to engage with the elections process. We want them to ask us the hard questions and come, have those interactions. And so, it's just the thinking about what more should we be doing.
Is it legal for a person to complete another person's ballot if blind or impaired?
So a voter with a disability can request assistance with any of the processes, but it has to be, a direct request from that voter. So if there were someone that, said, hey, I can do this for you, and they're doing it like in a different location or not under the direct supervision of the voter that, hasn't given them that permission, then that would be illegal. But if a voter needs assistance, they can ask for assistance from anyone of their choosing, but it can't be an employer or a representative of their labor union. But if they had a family member or someone else that they trusted that they wanted to have help them, assist them, the law does provide for that assistance. When you're an assister to somebody, you do also have to sign the absentee certification or the ballot, indicating that you served as the assister. And that way, if there were ever any questions down the road about whether or not that was, assistance that was asked for or requested, they would know who to contact.
This questioner asks, how can I trust absentee voting, drop boxes, and voter ID?
So I guess I would say that it's your local clerk that is the one that's administering all those things. So the law says that every voter has to provide photo ID. So if you're voting absentee, you have to provide a photo ID to your clerk. If you're coming to the polls, you have to show that photo ID to your poll worker. And so these are processes that are administered by your clerk. And so if you have questions about that process, if you're not sure how that's being done or if it's being done correctly in your community, then go observe. You can actually observe absentee voting. If you'd like to see the in-person absentee process and how they're checking IDs, making sure somebody's registered, if you'd like to see election day and how that process is taking place, you can go observe all of those processes. And if in the rare instance somebody isn't doing something correctly, there is a process, a complaint process, where you can bring that to the commission's attention, and they will actually then follow up officially with that election official to ensure that moving forward that they correct those procedures. And so, again, get involved. Go see for yourself. If you have those questions, you can actually go observe that process and make sure that it is operating in the way that's required under law.
So you just said get involved. So a couple questions that are along that line that I'll mash up here. Who counts the votes and how does one get into that? And what advice do you have for young people who may be participating in their first election?
Yeah, so who counts the votes? That is your poll workers or election inspectors, as they're called. So at your polls on election day or at your central count facility, there are folks that have been certified to be able to work at the election. In a lot of communities, you're actually going to see bipartisan poll workers that are involved in that process. There's a process for selecting poll workers where first they have to choose from a list submitted by both of the political parties to try to achieve a political balance. If they don't have enough poll workers from those lists, then they're choosing folks that are unaffiliated with the political parties. But these are your neighbors, these are your friends, these are your family, these are people from your community that are counting the ballots. And they don't get to go back into the back room and count the ballots. They're doing it right there in the public eye. And so you can actually go observe that process. But it's your poll workers, it's your neighbors, it's your family, it's your friends from your community that are the ones tabulating the vote.
So just a follow-up question. Given our divisive times, which is something Leader Ethics has worked hard to try to get information out, and you've been great, not just this session, but in others, helping to get information out. Is it more difficult today for you to recruit people to work at the polls?
So I think that varies a little bit from community to community, but what we're hearing is that across the state, we're actually seeing more people interested in being poll workers, probably because it seems like the political parties have been submitting lists in more communities than they ever have in the past. And so you might be seeing poll workers that are new to the process because they've gotten involved through their political parties. And so I haven't heard of any shortages this time around, but I still think that if folks are interested in that role, contact your municipal clerk. We're getting pretty close to the election here, but contact your municipal clerk. See if they need additional poll workers. If they don't, you can still go observe the process as well.
All good advice.
Do you know offhand, Meagan, of the poll workers statewide, what percentage of them would be off the party list and what would be unaffiliated, just volunteers?
Yeah, I think unofficially we're hearing that in a lot of places this year they're choosing, well, they have to by law, but they're using almost exclusively the poll workers from the party list because really they have to use those party lists before they can move on to their unaffiliated. And so I think in most communities they've seen pushes from the parties to submit these lists in volumes that they haven't seen in other years. So I would venture a guess that close to a majority of our poll workers probably are affiliated.
Yeah.
Do you think that Wisconsin will ever go to all-male voting or commissioners even having discussions about all mail-in voting?
Yeah, so I don't think that that the commission probably wouldn't have the authority to be able to make a change like that, but the legislature would. So, you know, perhaps in the future there could be a law considered. I haven't seen any bills that have been considered moving to that type of model. But here in Wisconsin, we have what's called no absentee voting. And so that means that you don't have to, or no excuse absentee voting. And so what that means is that anybody that's eligible and registered to vote is able to choose that option. So we certainly see different trends in terms of what option people utilize. In 2020, we went from a state that did about 6% absentee voting by mail. Most voters went to the polls on election day to vote. During the 2020 elections, we saw that number go up to about 66% of voters that participated by mail. We're now seeing those numbers come back down and sort of level out, but you know, it's always an option, and voters get to decide what is the right option for them. And so I think I haven't seen any indications that that process will change.
Do you happen to know, Meagan, how many states do everybody gets a ballot mailed to them? I know Colorado, I don't know how many there are that do
There's
that.
a handful. I guess I would say it's probably less than a dozen states that have automatic absentees that go out to voters. A lot of the West Coast states have that process. Here in Wisconsin, you have to first be registered, and then you're going to make a request for an absentee to your municipal clerk. And you have to provide your photo ID and whatnot as part of that process. But it is a request-based process. You'll never automatically get a ballot without making a request first.
Some wonderful questions. We'll try to follow up afterward and hope to put some of this on our Leader Ethics website. But as we wrap up, I'm going to ask Lee Roche to come up, but I want to finish with this one, not question, but comment. Meagan, thank you for your agency's work in elections training, administration, and working to ensure fair elections. Recalls, recounts, election results, you and your local clerks are great. So those compliments. Meagan, John, thank you for doing such a wonderful job. And with that, I will ask the founder and Chief Executive of Leader Ethics, Lee Roche, to wrap up this evening. Lee?
Thanks, Rusty, and thank you all for being part of today's program. And thank you, Meagan and John. There's a lot of information within the Wisconsin elections process, but I think tonight's conversation is a good way to highlight some of those things in a very easy to understand way, and I want to thank you for helping us work through that. I also want to talk about another event that's coming up on the calendar on October 3rd. It's also about elections in Wisconsin, and we're co-sponsoring it with a group called the Association of the Former Members of Congress. And they're going to be holding a town hall event here. It's actually going to be at the Pump House, and there will be former members of Congress on the panel along with election officials to talk about the process. So you'll have a chance to hear from Ron Kind, Reed Ribble, Tim Petri, and Scott Klug as part of that panel. That's October 3rd at the Pump House, and you can get information about that event at the Leader Ethics website. That's leaderethics.us. Again, I want to thank you, and let's show our appreciation for today's program. Thank you. Thank you. Best wishes and have a great evening.